U.S. Chapter 14, Section 2, From Isolation to Involvement. The focus question, how did Americans react to events in Europe and Asia in the early years of World War II? So things you should be able to do is describe the course of the early years of World War II in Europe, FDR's foreign policy in the mid-30s, and the great debate between interventionists and isolationists, and then how the U.S. became more involved in the conflict. So to give you a little bit of background, September 1935, if we look at what is keeping the average American up at night, and you can see it's mostly economic issues, particularly unemployment, budget, taxes. You know, how am I going to put food on the table? Am I going to continue to be able to do that? When you look at international issues, they're really in the background of things. And so you got to kind of keep that in mind when you're looking at FDR and then some of the criticism that he faces, as well as the big debate, because you know, most Americans are thinking about other things. So some of the early things, Japan's actions in China. So Japan is invading China. For the U.S. perspective, there's a few issues they're not very happy with. One is there was no formal declaration of war, which was something that wasn't very common. The next thing is just the brutality, the rape of Nanjing. And we had been working in China and trying to build a relationship in China, so we had a pretty strong presence in China. And that leads to a couple of U.S. sailors being killed. And FDR thinks we need to kind of move and be better prepared to protect not just our interests, but our citizens as well. So in response, he gives a speech, and he is basically saying that, you know, the United States, if we think that we're going to be protected from this spreading contagion of war, it's probably not going to happen. The world is pretty globally interconnected, and so he gave what he called the quarantine speech, that we need to try and we need to take action so that we can keep war from spreading to other places and infecting other places, because if we don't, then it's going to end up getting to the United States anyway. And so in order to do this, we should really work with other peace-loving nations and help them and try and contain this. And this is widely criticized by the American public. They aren't very happy. They think it's too interventionist, and FDR really has to kind of walk those things back a little bit. So if we look at the early stages of war in Europe, you have a couple different things going on. Hitler had kind of taken over the Czech Republic. He had taken over some areas that had been lost during World War II, and he really doesn't do too much for a while, but it's pretty short-lived peace. In 1939, he alarms the world when he signs a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. They have agreed that they're not going to attack each other. And during that meeting, what the rest of the world didn't know is that Germany and the Soviet Union had agreed to take Poland and divide it in half. So September 1st, they launch an invasion of Poland, and now what we have is, because these countries had, back in the Treaty of Versailles, promised the independence and the existence of Poland, they now are brought into war. So you have the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan, and you have the allies, who are Great Britain and France. The Soviet Union isn't taking sides, although they've agreed not to attack Germany. And the United States is still in the process of being neutral. They're not going to really declare war for another couple years here. The war really unravels pretty quickly, at least from the perspective of the Allies. Shortly after the invasion of Poland, Germany doesn't do much over the winter. However, in April and May of 1940, following the same invasion plan from World War I, they attack France from through the Ardennes forest, and pretty quickly they have captured most of France. It's at this time that the famous evacuation takes place at Dunkirk. What ends up happening is ships from all over the place come over, they pick up French and British troops and take them back over the English Channel to England, and so that really saves a lot of these forces. When we look at this invasion of France, France had prepared for an invasion of Germany. They had built this Maginot Line. The problem is they never really anticipated Germany going around the Maginot Line and going through the Ardennes forest. So they built this really expensive military wall that wasn't effective and basically didn't get used. So it says France built the world's greatest defense system, and the only test that it had, and it failed horribly. The other thing that they did is they cemented the guns in facing Germany. They didn't get them so they could rotate. And so once the Germans got behind the lines, there's nothing that it could do. When we look at what is Germany's plan from here, it is to destroy Britain through the air. So they're going to attack the Royal Air Force and hopefully take them out. They're going to bomb the ever-living heck out of London and hopefully soften up Great Britain. What Germany doesn't realize is that Britain has a secret weapon. They have radar, and they are able to pick these attacks up ahead of time, and they're able to successfully defend themselves. However, this whole bombing process is really kind of taking its toll. So America is still going to favor isolation. We're still recovering from the Great Depression. We still are bitter about World War I, and Congress had put together this Nye committee to examine what were the causes leading the United States to become involved in World War I. And from that, they pass a series of acts known as the Neutrality Acts, essentially listing all of these things that we couldn't do because they had led to involvement in World War I. So, for example, selling items to certain countries, to countries at war, allowing passengers to ride on ships of countries at war. So all those things that they thought, they were passing laws to prevent that from happening again, and that's what the Neutrality Acts are. Eventually what we get is interventionists do gain some ground, and they convince Congress to pass what is known as cash and carry, that countries can come over and buy goods with cash and then carry them back to their own country. So really the only thing we are doing is providing the goods. They are doing all of the transporting of the goods, and they're paying up front with cash. And that's a direction that the United States goes to begin to help some of these countries. For the isolationists, they think this has gone way too far. That this aid that we're giving to allies, even if they're carrying it on their own boats, is what is going to drag us into war. So little by little, FDR is kind of inching the United States towards involvement. Some of this is the fact that Germany is indiscriminately bombing. They're not hitting military targets, they're hitting civilian targets. The fact that this tripartite pact was signed between Germany, Italy, and Japan, that is also concerning the United States. And he is ultimately able to convince the United States to pass the Selective Service Act. And this is the only peacetime draft that the United States has ever had. But what it does is it starts to build up our military forces so that we are not totally at a loss if something were to happen. So we have a military that is growing and is getting bigger and is getting trained. And so we're starting to kind of move our way towards war. It's also at this time, or shortly after this time, that he gives his For Freedom speech. And really what he is doing is he is highlighting those things that he thinks the world needs to have. So if we can create a world where people are free from fear, free from want, free to speak their minds, and free to believe what they want to believe, that's going to eliminate a lot of problems around the world, because those are things that people all fight over. They want to make sure that they keep themselves safe. So if you get rid of fear, they don't have to worry about that. Their safety is in place. They want to be able to feed their families. They want to be able to think what they think and be able to say those things freely. And they want to be able to choose what to believe or whether to believe. And if you can give that to the world, hopefully we can avoid problems down the road. So when we look at what is the next step in this process, Lend-Lease is the next thing that we do. So again, he likens this to a neighbor's house on fire. We need to give whatever help we can in whatever manner we can to try and defend the United States. And so any of these nations that are going to help us, we should probably reach out and help them. So we're going to do this lend-lease policy where we're going to lend them some things that they need, and in exchange they're going to lease us some military bases around the world. The other thing that happens is FDR and Churchill meet and sign what's known as the Atlantic Charter. And in this charter is when FDR promises that when the United States enters the war, it will make sure that we look at Europe first and deal with the problems in Europe first, because FDR is telling him, listen, the people can't, the people of Great Britain can't continue to fight this war. We're getting wore down. We're getting beat up. We need to have something to keep us in the game. And that's where the Atlantic Charter comes in, where they are going to vow to destroy tyranny, as it says in this headline. And you know, it's praised overseas, but it's highly criticized in the United States. They think it's going way too far. The U.S. Navy is now running into problems with U-boats because Hitler is aware that we are helping, and so he really gives the green light to start to begin to attack U.S. ships, and U.S. ships turn around and begin to attack U-boats. So we are moving and inching ever closer to war.